Hello and welcome. I'm Anand Naidu sitting in for Riz Khan. One man, 1 year, 20 wars. That's the slogan that our guest today adopted for the ambitious journalism project he undertook. Kevin Seitz had been a veteran war correspondent for some of America's top media outlets, ABC, NBC, and CNN, when he decided to do something different. In late 2005, he packed up the tools of the trade in a backpack and set out alone to cover every war zone in the modern world. The list includes Lebanon, Afghanistan, Chechnya, Gaza, Iraq, Sudan, and Somalia. Kevin's work was published on a special website set up for Yahoo News, Kevin Seitz in the Hot Zone, and became a very popular place where people, especially the younger generation, could learn more about the reasons behind these conflicts, the human costs of these struggles, and their global impact. He chronicled his adventures in book form as well. In the Hot Zone, 1 Man, 1 Year, 20 Wars has just been published. Kevin Seitz's current project is People of the Web, a series of profiles on the people behind websites, videos, and other online phenomena. Don't forget, we take your calls on the show. You can reach us at the numbers there at the bottom of your screen. And Kevin Seitz joins us now from Los Angeles, California. Kevin, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
You know, you're a one-man band as a journalist. There are many things that people like you are called. They're called, I've heard the term mojos, mobile journalists, sojos, solo journalists, backpacker journalists. Tell us
some of them not as nice as that.
Right. And tell us exactly what is a backpacker journalist and what makes you different from a kind of conventional journalist?
Well, I think it's the idea of combining electronic journalism in the same way that a print journalist works. For me, I've been in television for most of my professional career, and I was always very envious of my print colleagues, the fact that they could be so mobile, that they could talk to people, their subjects, with very little interference by the electronic gadgets of my profession. And I simply wanted to adopt that style. It necessarily wasn't about being a pioneering approach in this. It was simply doing narrative form journalism, but approaching it as a print journalist, still using the electronic digital narrative and trying to tell the story that way.
And now you carry a backpack. What exactly is in that backpack?
Well, there's a lot of things, and even though the cameras and the gear has gotten a little bit smaller, the peripherals still make it a very heavy endeavor. For instance, my backpack weighs about 60 pounds. And I've got a video camera that I carry with me, a digital still camera, a laptop computer, a satellite modem, and all the batteries and peripherals and cords and cables that go along with that. So there's quite a lot of gear. And when I was working for the other networks like NBC and CNN, I had bureaus around the world that could resupply me if some of this gear went bad. But now that I've joined Yahoo News, we don't have bureaus around the world. You know, we have an electronic presence on people's computers, but I'm their only journalist working out in the field. And so if my gear goes down, I have to have replacements in my backpack, or I have to find a way to replace it myself. And that can be a difficult prospect sometimes when you're out in the middle of nowhere.
Well, let's go back a few years to 2004. You were already well known as a journalist then. As you'd mentioned, you'd been working for some of the biggest networks here in the United States. At that time, you were working for NBC, you were in Iraq, you were embedded with the US Army, you were covering the offensive in Fallujah, and there was an incident there which actually shot your name into major prominence, and that was an incident where an injured Iraqi insurgent was killed by a US soldier. There was a lot of controversy about that incident. Let's take a look at it first, and I want to ask you a few questions about it.
I was embedded with a Marine unit, and during the course of that battle, I videotaped a U.S. Marine shooting a wounded, unarmed insurgent in a mosque.
He's dead! Yeah, he's breathing. He's spanking, he's dead!
Now that incident there, where that injured insurgent was killed, it aroused a lot of deep emotions on both sides of the debate. I mean, you were praised as a courageous journalist, others vilified you as a traitor. What was going through your head when that happened?
Well, it was shocking for me. You know, I've covered war for a long time. In fact, I've had more experience in combat than probably most of the soldiers and Marines that I've been covering. And, you know, at that time period, I had been going back to Afghanistan and Iraq several times, and had been in Kosovo, had been in Nicaragua, had been in certain places in Latin America. And so I'd seen a lot of killing, I'd seen a lot of death and destruction, so this isn't the first time, you know, I saw combat, but that was the first real execution that I saw, you know, in a kind of a point-blank way. The details behind this particular incident is that the Marines were fighting a battle that Friday evening against insurgents who had placed themselves in that mosque, and there were about 15 insurgents in that mosque. And during the battle on Friday night, 10 of them were killed by the Marines and 5 were wounded. I went into the mosque after that battle, and I saw the 5 insurgents that had been wounded in that battle being treated by Marines, by Navy corpsmen that actually travel with the Marines. Their wounds were being bandaged. And I was told by the lieutenant colonel who was the battalion commander of that unit that the men would be taken behind lines and interrogated and treated according to Geneva Convention, you know, given aid, their wounds treated, and so on. But surprisingly, the next day, Saturday, we went back into that mosque. Certain Marine units had heard firing around the area, feeling that perhaps the insurgents had infiltrated the area to the rear of the Marines' position. So they went back into the mosque. And before I went in there, there was one particular Marine Lance Corporal who went in and he shot all 4 of the 5 insurgents that were in that mosque again, a second time, the men that had surrendered and were wounded the day before. They had been left in there. They had not been removed. And when I came in, he shot one of them a 3rd time, executing in point blank. That's what you saw on camera. And it became a flashpoint of a lot of controversy for a number of reasons. The war was already very polarizing in the United States and around the world. And in some cases, I think this spoke to Americans at the very question of our national character. You know, are we a nation that executes our prisoners? Are we a nation that violates the Geneva Convention, and so on? War certainly is confusing. There are a lot of moral choices that have to be made within a fraction of a second. There were mitigating factors. Insurgents had used booby traps on dead bodies, you know, within that particular fight in Fallujah. But this was a case where there was no immediate threat. I was in that mosque. I was no more than 20 feet away. I had seen what had gone on there the night before. This was the same Marine unit, not specifically the same squad that had been fighting that battle the day before, but it was the same Marine unit. And I don't know exactly what the circumstances are, why that particular Marine corporal did shoot that insurgent. But my feeling is it wasn't necessarily just an individual decision at that point. My feeling is perhaps there was a relaxation in the rules of engagement within the Battle of Fallujah that allowed, at least that was reported down by higher command, for these soldiers and Marines to perhaps execute prisoners or wounded combatants. And the reason I say that is there were 3 other incidents within Fallujah where the same type of thing happened, where prisoners were executed. So this may not have been just an individual decision by a specific Marine, but perhaps it came down from higher up.
Kevin, let's look at one of your more recent projects, the project you undertook for Yahoo News, where you visited 20 conflict zones in 1 year. Now, as you pointed out, Yahoo doesn't have bureaus in various parts of the world. You don't have a support structure that a big network would have. So you were there alone, going into these very hostile zones. Firstly, how do you get into these zones?
Well, I had a team here in California that would help me get the visas that I needed to get into these places, and a lot of them you could simply fly into a certain region. And I would work with international aid organizations, local fixers, people that we hired that could translate and help me navigate, you know, both the culture, the language, the physical dangers in all of these specific areas. For instance, when I went into Somalia, at that time period, it was September 2005, and Somalia at that time had not had a central government for 14 years. And I had been the first Western journalist in there, I think in a period of about 4 months, and it was still very chaotic. And I had to have 8 bodyguards. I had a local fixer that I worked with that had worked with colleagues of mine. I had never reported in Somalia before. But he met me at the airport with 8 different bodyguards, 6 of them carrying AK-47 rifles and 2 of them carrying machine guns. And it was a very prudent move in some ways, at least in terms of my protection. It didn't help me gather the stories because they kind of created a phalanx around me, you know, in some ways preventing me from, you know, interacting with people. But, you know, it was a situation where each of those men was from a different clan within Somali society. And so when we hit certain checkpoints manned by that specific clan, one of the men from my personal security unit would be able to go up and talk to them and ease our transition.
You know, you visited many dangerous places. I mean, I'm looking at the list here: Lebanon, Somalia, Iraq, Congo. The list does go on. Are you able in any way to identify one place that was perhaps the most dangerous of all those places that you visited?
Well, for me, in a lot of ways, I don't think it was just, you know, a matter of bombs and bullets that were the danger. You know, there's a lot of grinding loneliness in this experience, you know, being separated. I speak only one language. You know, I'm a product of the American education system in one way that doesn't prize speaking many languages, unfortunately. And so, you know, I felt very isolated in some ways, sometimes having only my translator to speak with in English. And the dangers that I faced, certainly they were significant in certain places, certainly in Somalia, in the Congo, in Iraq and Afghanistan, certainly during the Israeli and Hezbollah conflict. But I don't want to overstate it. You know, the people that live there on a permanent basis face those dangers all the time. It's my choice to go into them, and I feel my responsibility as a journalist. What I wanted to do was put a human face on these conflicts, to talk to the people in the regions, not necessarily the presidents and the prime ministers, but the people that were victims, the combatants, the people on the front lines of these conflicts, and really learn what was going on, and hopefully provide a bridge specifically to American viewers who know very little about these regions, so they could understand more of what was going on in those regions, and also understand what their government what role their government has to play in these places, militarily, economically, politically.
Well, you know, you talk about putting a human face on many stories. There was one story that you covered, and I think you covered it for Yahoo. To me, when I first read it, it was an absolute horror story. And let me quote from the Yahoo website. This was the headline. The headline was, "Married at the age of 4, an Afghan girl was subjected to years of beatings and torture, finally escaping to discover that within all the world's cruelty, there is also some kindness." Tell us about that story.
Well, that was an amazing story for me because it came late in the journey. I was in Afghanistan and I was working with a friend of mine, a colleague that I had worked with back in 2001 during the overthrow of the Taliban. And he found this little girl for me that had actually been placed in an orphanage at that time, but she had been married or promised in marriage at the age of 4 to a family after her father died. The mother remarried and the stepfather did not want her, couldn't afford to keep her, so they basically sold her to another family. And at the age of 4, she was made to take care of 12 individuals. You know, at the age of 4, you need someone to take care of you, not to be taking care of other people. And she was unable to keep up with the workload, and she was beaten horrifically everywhere but on her face. The quote-unquote father-in-law said to his children, "You can beat Gulsoma anywhere you want, just don't mark her face so there's no evidence." And she was almost killed. Eventually she escaped after years of this kind of abuse. And I asked her when I interviewed her, I said, "How can you ever trust people again after what you went through at such a young age?" And she said to me, "Well, there were lots of people along the way that were kind to me. There were people that snuck me blankets because she was forced to sleep outside, people that gave me food because she was, you know, almost starved to death. And there was one particular boy within the family that never touched her, and he yelled at the other members of the family not to hurt her, that this was unjust, that Gulsoma was his sister, you know, quote unquote. And she felt like people are generally good. There are people that were mean to her, but people are generally good in the world. And I think the larger significance of this story is that so many of the people that I met in my journey, so much of the death, destruction, and tragedy that I chronicled within this book, in the Hot Zone, there are also the stories of resilience, like Gulsoma, people overcoming that tragedy and that destruction and not being filled with hate, but being filled with forgiveness. Another good example of that is in the Congo, where rape as a weapon of war is endemic. 4,500 cases of rape within just 2 provinces in 7 months. The UN humanitarian chief there says it's the worst place for sexual violence in the world. And I interviewed many of the rape victims, some of them who had children that were the results of these rapes. And they said to me in so many ways that their lives were horrible, and yet they overcame them by giving those children names such as hope or goodness or love, transforming those acts of hate almost into acts of resilience, of hope, of endurance. And it made me realize that their stories were very important to tell. And I think we're starting to hear more about what's happening in the Congo. You know, what people don't realize, so many of these conflicts are going on and they're not even on the radar, especially in America. 4 million people have died in the Congo since 1997. It's been called Africa's first world war. There's so much bloodshed that has gone in there. So many nations were involved. And again, it is about the fight over resources, diamonds, gold, and coltan. and yet we never hear about it. And this is what I wanted to bring out in the book and in the Hot Zone reporting on the website.
Kevin, I want to go to an email that's come in from one of our viewers, and this viewer's question is, why do people like you and Robert Fisk of the London Independent newspaper seem to be able to access stories that the mass media journalists ignore? Is it mass media's fear of alienating the powers that be in their government? Is it sheer laziness, or is it the time and media formats that constrain them? That was from Carl Eisenbach in Mexico.
Well, I have to say it's very nice to be placed in the same category as Robert Fisk. Tremendous journalist who's done a lot of good in reporting regions of the world, especially what's been going on in the Middle East. I don't believe that all the journalism that's being done out there, especially in the mainstream media, is bad journalism. I think there's some terrific journalism out there by intrepid and innovative investigative reporters. I think what we're really hampered with at this point is really a lack of resources. It's an economic problem, not necessarily a problem of innovation or determination. Journalists want to cover the news. It's what we do. We want to go to places that do pose dangers and tell stories that are there, because they're stories of incredible drama, inherent drama, that I think are very powerful and transform us as well as our viewers and our readers. But at the same time, the resources aren't there. When I pitched the Hot Zone to Yahoo, I think that if I had gone to any other newsroom around the country in America, I would have been laughed out of there. Yahoo was in the mood to cover news. It was a new project for them, and they were willing to do it, but it's not sustainable. They didn't want me to continue doing that. It was a project that was 1 year in length, and I think the problem is paying for the news. How do we pay for this kind of coverage? Unfortunately, a lot of people are fixated, especially in this country, with entertainment news. What's going on with Lindsay Lohan and Britney Spears, and unfortunately that means that we're getting a diet of junk food on a regular basis rather than nutritious information that teaches us about our world and tells us what's going on. And my contention is that these stories that I reported are just as dramatic as anything that's happening in Hollywood. In fact, they're much more dramatic because they deal with real people, they deal with stories of survival. And perhaps it's just finding a way to put a human face on these conflicts, not just telling them as kind of dry issue stories, but letting individuals know that there are people behind these conflicts. There are things going on that they can relate to and understand and be interested in.
Well, Kevin, we have about half a minute left, and I was wondering if you could tell me, you mentioned the name of Robert Fisk there. Who is the journalist that you most admire?
There are a lot of journalists that are out there that are doing wonderful work. I want to name one to you right now named Alexandra Boulat. And she was a photographer that I did not know, but she was a conflict photographer that died recently of a brain aneurysm. She was French. And she said a quote that meant a lot to me, because I think this is also the thesis of my book. She said, "You can cover a war with never showing a gun." And that's the problem that we as journalists, we emphasize the combat, which is the smallest part of every conflict, and we underestimate the collateral damage, which is the dominant feature of every war. We have to do what Alexandra Boulat was doing, which was sometimes
Kevin,
show war without showing the guns.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt you there. We've run out of time. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
The book is called In the Hot Zone, 1 Man, 1 Year, 20 Wars by Kevin Seitz. It's just been published. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget, if you have any thoughts about pressing issues around the world, send your emails to riz@aljazeera.net. Street Talk is next.